welcome back to the GSP YouTube channel. I'm going to do kind of a impromptu talk a little bit about a Transbrake. I made a Transbrake video that's in the editing pile, and the reality of it is I'm just not happy with it. And so this is going to be a little less formal than what I did, but the main point of this is the information, and I want to get that out to you guys is sooner than later. So I am sitting in my recliner. The cat is in my lap. If you hear the cat purring, just bear with me. This is as impromptu as it gets. So let's set up a Transbrake. The tune that I have pulled up here already has a complicated Transbrake setup, and you'll see that in the pin map shortly. But I'm going to show you how to set up a basic, I want to lock the transmission, stage my car, or I want to lock the transmission and bump in to stage my car. And so first things first, let's just go to the system ICF and basic IO. This is going to be in all of your Terminator X setups, whether it's a max or whether it's a base ECU, doesn't matter. Go to staging and click enable. And when you do that, it's going to take these grayed out items and make them selectable. So what's important to note here is that the difference between single pulse and duty cycle is on a single pulse, every time you press the bump button, you're going to get this time that the Transbrake is disabled. So what you're going to do is you're going to press the Transbrake button, and that is going to arm the Transbrake. That's going to lock first and reverse together, and then every time you press the bump button, it's going to unlock for this duration. Now, if you go ahead and add duty cycle, there's two more things in here. And this is kind of nice. This is in the later versions of the V2 software, this pulse time calculator. So what it effectively does is it tells you how long each one of the individual pulses is, but when you run duty cycle, you can just simply hold the button and it's going to run a duty cycle PWM controlled on the solenoid. And what that effectively is going to mean for you is this is how you do what I call creep, where you press and hold the button and it will basically walk into the beams if it's properly calibrated. And honestly, for like 90% of you guys, I think this is probably going to do what you need it to do. So the way you'd set this, obviously at duty cycle of 100%, that means that nothing's really going to happen, right? It's going to run the output at 100% duty cycle, which means always on. So let's just say we're going to set this to like 75% duty cycle. And I'm not saying you should set yours to 75. You should start high and work your way down. And the other thing that I typically would do whenever I'm doing my testing is set this time value pretty big, because you want to be able to not have to worry about is the time what's holding me back, or is the actual duty cycle what's holding me back. So I'd set this to something like 5 seconds. What that means is that every time you press the bump button, if you hold it down, it's going to go for 5 seconds. If you come off the bump button, then it's going to stop. So duty cycle of 75%, this frequency or pulses per second, it's in hertz, which is typically known to be number of cycles per second. This is something that you're going to also have to play with. It goes together with duty cycle. I'd probably start at somewhere like 10 hertz. So what that tells you is, check this out. This is kind of cool. So before I had, if I'm doing single pulse, I had a pulse in here of 0.08, and that's usually where I start. And I'll just increase that time until I get the desired bump. Every now and then on whatever car you're working on, if it's a light car and it makes a lot of power, then you know, it might be too much. Like a single pulse might be too much. So you would go to duty cycle. When you go to duty cycle, if you set this at, let's say we set this at 80%, bam, check that out. Each individual pulse is going to be 0.08 seconds, and that is because of 10 hertz, meaning 10 times per second at 80%. You're going to get multiple pulses of that. So obviously, if this one time was too much, this is going to be too much because it's going to keep doing it. So what would we do? We could do something like 90%. Or we could do something like 75 and only 5 hertz. You know, we could ramp this up and down, play with this all over. I'm not trying to make this, you know, comprehensive. You could do something like 15 hertz here. So you can see I just made this shorter, but I'm going to do it more often. And what that's going to equate to is if your band will release in the transmission fast enough, it's very easy to adjust this and get the car to do what I would call creep, where it'll just kind of walk into the beams. The point of it is to make it where it's not so violent that the chassis is upset and it's still rocking as the light turns green, and you're sitting there and you don't know if your weight transfer is on the back tires or is it on the front tires, and how is that going to make the car behave differently when you let go of the button, all that stuff. So, real quick as well, while we're talking about how to actually make this work, there's going to officially be 2 Holley inputs that are available in the pin map and 1 output. So you got staging input 1 and staging input 2 that need to be assigned. So staging input 1 would go, that's your Transbrake button. So in this case, when I provide ground to the Transbrake button, and yes, that can be set to 12 volts, then I will put that on the input, which in this particular case would be A3, right? Because you can see I have some custom stuff set up that I'm going to show you next, and that's on this Transbrake button. So staging input 1 is the same thing as the Transbrake button. Staging input 2 is the same thing as the bump button. So that's really important to note. Those are both inputs, and the reason I say that kind of slowly is there's a lot of confusion around I/O and what's an input and what's an output. If you want the ECU to do something, and in this case we want the ECU to control the Transbrake, it's important to note that whenever you press this button, you're not actually controlling the Transbrake. You're simply telling the ECU that you want it to do something with the Transbrake, and the ECU has to make the decision of what to do with that. So you're going to tell the ECU, which is the equivalent of a bump box, that I want you to arm the Transbrake whenever I press staging input 1. And then once that's armed, you can press staging input 2 to enable the bump. Now, as far as how to control the actual Transbrake physically, we need to go to an output. In this particular case, we are looking for staging output. Please ignore the rest of this stuff. I'll explain all that shortly. You'll see I've got Transbrake trigger and bump trigger and all this stuff that's not actually doing anything. I will explain that here in just a second. Transbrake output is my custom output that I'm using in order to run this brake. However, if I was simply doing a standard method, I would grab this staging output and drag it down to output number 2. I'll show you what that looks like here. I gotta take this off. We'll put this up here for now. Staging output, drag that down, put that on output 2. Okay. So we're going to set 2 inputs, 1 output. This PWM minus output, it's going to end up being a gray wire, is going to go to, if you're going to use bump, it's got to go to a solid state relay. And there's different solid state relays, and that's kind of outside of the scope of the control video here. But basically, long story short, this is a PWM minus signal, and this is going to be the negative side of your relay. The typical 3-wire relay that I like to run with the NOS relay that is kind of a Holley product, that thing has got a large current power in, a large current power 12 volts out, 12 volts in, 12 volts out, and a small wire that is the ground trigger. This would go on that ground trigger. All right, so I'm going to set this back up here, Transbrake output. Okay, so we're back to where we were. Now, let's talk about a complicated one. The way that I do this is hard to keep up with, so I'm gonna try to go slow. I'm gonna try to be concise here. The goal of what I'm getting ready to show you is 3 or 4-fold. A lot of you guys know that you have to run the Transbrake button. You have to press the Transbrake button whenever the car is in reverse in order to get reverse to even engage. And that can, at times, be annoying. A lot of people just deal with it. But in the case of this particular setup, this is actually a Jake's D3 Transbrake on a 4L80. And that means a couple of extra things for us. Because it's on a 4L80, and that 4L80 is controlled by this ECU, I have a little more information at my disposal. I know what gear the driver has selected, and whenever the driver selects the reverse gear, I want to be able to command the Transbrake to come on, thus enabling the driver to not have to worry about this. The transmission's just going to act like normal. Let me show you how I did that. I'm going to also show you how I did a safety, because we have speed thanks to the transmission ICF or the transmission wiring. We have speed, so we can also set up a safety where the Transbrake won't enable over a certain mile per hour. I think I chose 3 or 4 in this case. And the goal there is just to make it where, if this is a street vehicle, right? So if we're going down the road, the last thing you want to do is bump that Transbrake button and grab third and reverse at the exact same time. That would be like catastrophic. So in order to not do that, I've also set up a safety. So let's just dive into this. I'm going to clear all this out. All right, we're starting from a clean slate here. If you don't have the inputs outputs ICF, you can go to the toolbox, add individual config, and pick the IO ICF. So in this case, I've already got it. And as far as inputs, let's start there. And I'll show you what I did for a Transbrake button and a bump button. Okay, so it's very simple. They're ground, and they're not anything exotic. Whenever J1A3 and J1A13 get ground, either the Transbrake button or the bump button is defined as being pressed. This is a discrete input that is coming from the steering wheel, and it is wired to ground. Moving on to outputs, this is where the fun starts. And you guys will see that this is like very convoluted. I have intentionally put all of my what I like to call internal variables that you can do with a Dominator but you can't do with a Terminator X. Well, here's the way around it. You can set up these internal variables, I don't know what else to call them other than that, that are not defined to go to anything. They simply are going to air, and they don't have a wire associated with them, but they're still active in the ECU. You can still make decisions based off of whatever's going on. So let's just take a look at this real fast. So Transbrake output. This is the actual physical output wire that goes to the solid state relay that's going to run our Transbrake. I'm gonna go backwards in so that you guys can kind of see where the thought process lies here. So with the Transbrake output, if I click configure, it's going to show me everything that I have going on. I have something called Transbrake trigger set up. And the reason that I have that is because I want to trigger the Transbrake with multiple items. I want to do it with reverse being selected. I want to disable it based on speed or enable it based on speed, however you want to think of it. And I also want the button to be capable of running the Transbrake trigger. So the important thing here is to note this PWM setup is what's actually physically controlling the Transbrake, okay? So what's important is I have my trans range position down here, and I don't want to run the Transbrake, okay, when I'm in park or neutral, or if I'm pressing the bump button in reverse. I think that's kind of obvious, but anyway, this is the bump trigger will be self-explanatory here in just a minute as soon as I show you that. But this is the actual table that's controlling the Transbrake. The way that I have this set up, I'm gonna have to bounce around, guys. I'm sorry. I was gonna try to make this linear, but I just can't. I've got to bounce around a little bit. Let's go look at bump trigger, and I'll show you. So bump trigger, that is related to bump button, okay? And the bump trigger, this is something you have to do with the Terminator X, and you don't, this would be the Terminator X equivalent of doing this for like a 20-volt setup on a Dominator. But in order to choose on the Transbrake output, this column over here, in order to choose the bump button, right? So I want to be able to go from 0 to 1, or from something to something else, so that I can have a breakpoint and know I'm either off the button or on the button. And the way that I was able to set this up, if you chose just ground for that bump button, it won't work. It won't do that. You can't choose bump trigger in here right there, you can't choose this if it's just a ground because it's not a configurable axis. You actually need this to be an axis that has range to it. So let me show you how I got around that. If I go to outputs, bump trigger, go to configure, okay. So what I'm going to say is that this bump trigger is going to be active whenever I press the bump button. Now check, this is extremely simple, but I know it's complicated, but it's actually extremely simple. All I'm telling this thing to do is I'm going to activate it when I press the bump button, and it says, what are you going to do whenever the bump button is pressed? So if I go into PWM setup, this stuff needs to be here. It needs to be set as fixed. It needs to have some amount of frequency in it. It needs to be set as duty cycle. Otherwise, it's going to work off of time. It doesn't matter what the X and Y axis are here. All this means is that I'm going to be 100%, okay, when bump trigger is pressed. This entire table is 100%. So in any given case, whenever the bump button, when this bump button is pressed, then in my outputs, this is an internal variable, the bump trigger is going to activate when the bump button is pressed, and it's going to go to 100% duty cycle. Okay, so what does that mean for us? If I go to my Transbrake output, and you see in PWM setup, the y-axis is bump trigger. Well, what that means is that whenever the bump trigger is not pressed, when the button is not pressed, then my bump trigger percent is 0. This could actually be a 2-cell column here. It doesn't have to be 15 of them, but I can't make it 2, so we just split it at 50%. So I'm always working off of either 0 or 100%. And what that means for us is, if you look at the break point here, the Transbrake trigger, if it's above 50% when you're pressing the Transbrake button, it works the exact same way. It's a PWM output that goes to nothing. When the Transbrake is active, the bump trigger gets 100%. If we go back, I'll show you this other output, the Transbrake trigger. So this one's a little more complicated because first off, the Transbrake button has to be enabled, or, this is the important part, this is the reverse aspect of it. If the trans range position is above -2, which is park, if it's above -2, which means it'd be -1 or higher, which is reverse, then it'll enable. If trans range position is below 0, which is -1, which is reverse, then the Transbrake will also enable. PWM setup is going to show you that in reverse, at any mile per hour, 0 to 15, which means that anything above 15 as well is going to be 100%. So it's going to stay, if you put it in reverse, the Transbrake is going to activate anytime that this is in place. Okay. Also, the Transbrake is not going to activate in first, second, third, or fourth gear above 3 miles per hour. Do you see why? So we got zeros in this entire speed table if the trans range position is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is the Transbrake trigger. This is not the Transbrake output, this is the Transbrake trigger. Alright, so Transbrake output only becomes active whenever the Transbrake trigger is above 50%. And if we go back to the trigger table, you'll see that it's either 0 or 100 and only in reverse or below a certain speed if it's in gear. Sorry this is so disorganized, guys. I just don't know how to do it any other way. Alright, so we've got the pump trigger, we've got the Transbrake trigger. The speed is actually encompassed right here in this thing. Now, let's get to simple Transbrake tuning, right? That's the other half of this is, okay, fine, you figured out how to trigger it and how to make it do everything you want it to do, but how do you make the car actually do what you want it to do? That's these settings right here in the actual Transbrake output. This is what's happening to the solid state relay. So, in this particular case, when the bump button is over 50%, which means the bump button is pressed, we're going to operate in this region if we are in gear 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, cool part about one of those Jake's D3 setups is if you pick 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can still launch in first gear, whatever gear the transmission actually is in. So I went ahead and just left this active for all of these. So in this case, we're going to run a 60% duty cycle at a frequency of 5 hertz, right? The thing that you need to remember here is both of these go hand in hand to make the Transbrake do what you want it to do. If you increase the frequency a whole bunch, then not a whole lot's going to happen, even if you have a low duty cycle, because it's going to happen so fast the solenoid has no opportunity to react. Additionally, if your frequency is set really low, but your duty cycle is set very high, you're not actually turning it off for any significant amount of time, and you have the same problem. There's no off time that's sufficient to make the car creep. So what I typically will do, my starting settings, and please don't hang me for this, anybody, I will go ahead and come in here and put 90% in these cells. So we're going to start with 90% duty cycle, and I'll start with a frequency of 15. And that 9 times out of 10, I'm going to say 95 out of 100, will not let the car move. It typically will not move. What I will do then is come down and bring this to something like 12, and we'll set this to about 85%. Bringing them down together until the thing actually starts to move. Now, can you do one or the other? Sure, you absolutely can do one or the other. Like, there's no problem with trying something. Just understand that this thing is you're tuning on a car that is getting wound up to go launch, and you're going to need to be a little bit careful. Make sure there's nothing in front of you. Okay. The other thing that I want to add here is that if you guys don't have a 4L80 with a Jake's D3 on it, and you just want to run a custom Transbrake setup and not the canned Holley one, but you have a manual trans, a non-computer controlled trans. This bottom axis here can be anything you want it to be. It can be RPM, it can be boost, it can be a deal where due to the car making more power with more RPM or more boost, whatever it is, you can have different settings in these cells instead of these cells, so that when you turn the car up at the track, you don't have to go in and adjust your Transbrake. You can tune it at all different power levels, and that's really the main merit to running a custom output for a Transbrake and not using the Holley setup, is if you're turning the car up and down a whole lot. So real quick, let's just make that just so you see what that's going to look like. So we have our Transbrake button, we have our bump button. I'm going to reuse those. We're going to go to the output, and the only thing I'm going to reuse out of the output here is bump trigger. Okay. And the reason is I have to use that in order to get that Y-axis column to be set as the bump trigger. So let's make another output. This one we're going to call it test brake, and we're going to enable it, and it's going to be a PWM, and it says, okay, please configure. You got it. All right. So PWM setup wise, we're going to go to fixed. Frequency is going to be, what did I say, 15. Our duty cycle percent is going to be about 90 when we get started here. Let's say the x-axis, we're going to make the x-axis, let's say RPM this time. And remember, your y-axis has got to be the bump trigger here. Okay. So we'll configure this. I'm going to go 0 to 100. Really, again, it does not matter. This is just what I would like for it to look like. So let's say we're going to launch the car anywhere from 2,500 to 5,000 RPM. And we'll do a fill row values. Okay, so we got all these different RPM ranges. And just keep in mind that if the bump is going to be off, then we want 100%. Okay. That means that the trans brake is going to be activated. And I'll explain the trigger setup in just a moment. These are the cells up here that's going to define how much duty cycle you're going to run whenever you press the button based on RPM. Okay. So to start with, I would set the whole thing at 90. And if you set the whole thing at 90, go out and test. Let's say you end up not liking that, and you end up at a frequency of 10, and you end up at 80% duty cycle. Okay. And at 3,000 RPM, that works fantastic. And then you start working on your two-step stuff, and you get it all the way up to 4,000, and it's a little spicy up at 4,000. Okay, we can fix that. So just come in here, highlight these cells, and we'll set these to 85%. Okay, and let's say that up here you can't even really get up here on the brake, so these cells don't matter. Then just leave them at 80. Or if you're worried about it, say you're afraid that if you do ever get up there you're going to be in trouble, set them at 100. You could even set them at 90. So we'll set them at 90. And you go, okay, well, what about at 3,300 or 3,500? Okay, well, you say 3,000 liked 80 and 3,500 we don't know yet, and 4,000 it liked 85. Watch this. Grab that, fill row values. Now you got a good shot that it's going to be somewhere in the middle. So you can set all this stuff up to run different duty cycles. Just keep in mind that we're only going to really be working in this 100 cell because we're using that bump trigger. Let's go back to the triggers and I'll show you how to set this up. So the first things first, you're obviously, the Transbrake button has to be pressed in order for this to work, right? That's the simplest test that has to be performed. If the Transbrake button is pressed, this output that you're setting up is going to do what you tell it to do based on this bump button. Now, real quick, just to circle back, bump trigger is set up because I need that y-axis. The bump button right here activates the bump trigger, which is bump button is enabled, PWM setup. It's going to be 100%. It's going to go to 100% when the button is pressed. All right, guys, that is as clear as mud. I am very sorry that is not more concise, and this is a very extensive tune to show you the two extremes. But we did just go through and set up a test break here to kind of show you what this is going to look like. And if you have any questions, please leave the comments below. I try to answer everybody that I possibly can. You can always ping me on Facebook as well, either under the GSP Facebook page or Aaron White is my personal account. I'm happy to answer questions on either of them. And if this is just truly awful, please let me know, and I will do it again and try to make it more concise. But hopefully these are 3 different examples of how you can set up a Transbrake, and one of them will work for you. And all that said, please like, subscribe, ring the bell, all the stuff that I have to say to try to get a YouTube channel going. I'd really like to get to 1,000 subscribers so I can start doing live stuff, and I just think that'd be a lot of fun. And in the meantime, hope you guys have some wonderful trips to the track and some awesome Transbrake setting testing that is inevitable at this point. All right, that's it. See you guys next time.